Hello everyone and welcome back. We're glad to have you for this video where we have documented our process as we build this game-changing carport out on our desert homestead property. You may have seen some of this more recent footage. This was us just marking out this concrete template. That way we knew the width and depth kind of the hole that we would need to dig down in order to pour our concrete in that would hold our 4x4 post. Paul spent the majority of the day just digging out all 6 of those holes to the required depth that would be needed. Once that was completed, we decided to run some string across in order to give us a nice visual of the center points. This would help us when we placed those brackets into the freshly poured concrete. And here are those brackets that will hold our 4x4 post. Paul cut the templates to the depth that we needed. Once that was done, he placed them in and then tamped the ground at the bottom in order to ensure that nothing loose was still in there. We then added a little bit of gravel in the bottom, and then it was time to get mixing all of that concrete. Here is our first finished ones. It's a little rough, but believe me, we got a little bit better the more that we went on. If you remember in another video, we made a quick trip over to Tucson in order to pick up a very large lumber order, and that is where all this lumber that we have brought back to the property is going to come into play for this project. Next up, it was shushugi boning all of this lumber that we had brought that was untreated. This is a Japanese practice where essentially you are charring the outside of the wood. You will go back in with a brush, scrape off the required amount of carbon off of there, and then at the end it'll get a coating of linseed oil. This helps protect against bugs and also the harsh conditions of the heat and warping that can happen out here in the desert. Here's all of those finished brackets sitting up nicely. When we started this next portion, unfortunately, as you can see those clouds coming in, we were fighting against clouds and rain moving into the area. We would level the posts to make certain that they were good to go, and then after that Paul would add the hex screws, washers, and then make sure to go back and retighten everything. Here is a quick time lapse of the entire process of us just repeating that over and over for all of these posts. And unfortunately, the rain eventually caught up to us, so this is all that we were going to get done for that particular day. When the weather improved, we were able to get back out there. This time we were focused on cutting down the 4x4 post from 12 foot to a more manageable size due to the fact that a lot of our ladders were only about 8 foot in height, so it was very difficult for us to reach that high. So here Paul was cutting off the extra ends with our chainsaw, and then on a next part, once that was completed, he was measuring out in order to start notching the 4x4 posts so that some of the front beams could sit snugly onto there. Unfortunately, I need to mention that Paul has a huge phobia of heights and this is a terrible project for him to be working on. So at this point, unfortunately, this did kind of get the better of him, and while he was cutting here with the chainsaw, it wasn't very even. So he did try to go back manually by hand and cut it out. and do the best he could. After this, I kind of picked up the slack and cut the rest of the notches in the rest of the 4x4 front post. After that, it was us trying to get those front post up and onto the notched ledges that we had created. We ended up putting kind of a help screw there on the left post so it could sit on there so Paul could reach it and I could try to help him the best that I could. Eventually we got the front and the back completed. Here Paul is placing more of the lumber up on there, that way it gives us more support and gives us room for our angle braces, which is this next step. We took a 2x4 that was lying around, cut it as a template before we cut into our 4x4 post, which would then be used for the angle braces. The angle braces are just an additional support from a lot of the heavy winds that we get out here. Paul was able to place it up there just to make sure that everything fit snugly, and then once that was confirmed, he went ahead and placed the long timber lock screws into place to hold it together. And it's a good thing to point out that Paul is doing this with a fear of heights and then also in 30 to 40 mile per hour winds some days. Eventually he got a nice start for the angle braces there, and then we called it a day. But we were back to it as he finished up placing those angle braces on all of the corners. After that was completed, he was able to take those braces off of the 4x4 post. And this next step, he was starting on the rafters. There you saw him cutting the birds' mouths onto these rafter boards. And here he is actually placing them up there and just double checking to make sure that they fit accurately. All in these crazy winds. But with those crazy winds, it brings some absolutely amazing sunsets out here. Here's just a small footage of Paul shimmying the boards up there for the rafters, just getting them in place, that way he can move them where he needs them to be. Once he gets them into place and snugly and spaced out to where he needs them to be, he is then going to go back and add some hurricane ties onto here, which will also be another safeguard against those crazy winds that we see out here in the desert Southwest. We placed one of these pretty much at each end of the boards, that way we had extra security. Here you'll see him using a pre-cut 2x4 in order to know where and how far to space the rafter boards. Eventually, Paul was able to get all of the rafters up and completed. Which brings us to our next step of adding the purlins on top. These are boards that go crossways on the rafters, and essentially what we will do is then place our metal roofing on top of these boards. And here is Paul shimmying up the rest of the purlins that he was working on. This is a great time to mention to you guys, we're not professionals by any means. This is the first substantial building project like this Paul and I have ever worked on, ever. And so I'm sure some builders out there who have years of experience are probably cringing watching us do this, but it's all a learning process, and we wanted to bring it and show it to you that even if you don't have those years of experience, you can still do this. Don't be afraid, don't be afraid of making mistakes. So we're glad to have you along on this journey, and we hope you've subscribed to us by now so you can keep up with us. Paul was able to complete all of the purlins on top of our rafters, and while we waited for our metal roofing order to come in, we decided to work on another separate project, which was turning half of this, or starting to turn half of this, into a storage area for Paul and his equipment. So here Paul is cutting the boards down. We put these little joist rafter brackets in between. That way the boards could fit kind of snugly in there on the inside. Once we had those in place, we ended up using some metal siding to put over top of those boards. And eventually this will wrap all the way around. We'll have a doorway placed in, but that will be for a much future video. Eventually though, we did get our roofing order in, and so we could start that part of the project. This is a very hillbilly way of doing this, but we ended up just kind of tracing out where our 2x4s are after placing one of our metal roofing panels up there. We'd pull it down and then pre-drill everything on there just to make certain that we weren't going to miss anything. I know that's really crazy, but it worked for us. We did lose a drill bit here and there trying to get through the metal, but eventually we were able to get all of those completed and pre-drilled and ready to hang up. Again, Paul has a pretty substantial phobia of heights, so he did his best by climbing up and getting around the edges where he could, as far as he could reach. And then what I would do then is go up and climb on top of the roof and screw in anything else that was remaining up there. But eventually we had finally completed the metal roofing, which then kind of concluded temporarily this build of our carport. We will have more again on that side building part of it that we're going to be working on, but for now this is a huge game changer for us out here. It gives us shade from the hot sun. We can park our trailer underneath of it. If you see off to the left the IBC totes, we can now collect rainwater, which is huge, and then Paul eventually will have storage over there. So we thank you for joining us on this project. We hope you will continue to follow us. Thanks, my friends. Take care. See you next time.